France has been operating from the shadows in dominating many countries in Africa. All the way from owning their resources to controlling their currency, it has shown no signs of ever giving up. After realizing that independence in Africa was almost inevitable, in 1958, France organized a referendum asking whether sub-Saharan African countries under its domination wanted to become independent on French terms. Guinea, led by one of the few African leaders who was a trade unionist and not a loyal French ally, voted no to this independence and broke away from France 2 years before the rest. For the others, it was independence without full sovereignty, and the independence was on the conditions of signing the cooperation agreements. The idea was to create new republics with limited autonomy under the tutelage of France, and all sovereign commands would be exercised by Paris. When Guinea decided to issue its own national currency in 1960, France organized a sabotage operation to destabilize the new country, sending in its service secret agents, flooding the economy with false banknotes, and disrupting everything. This eventually sent a clear message to other countries such as Mali, Ivory Coast, Burkina-Faso, Benin, Niger, Senegal, Togo, Chad, Cameroon, Guinea-Bissau, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and Central African Republic that if you want to go down that road, you know what happens. And from then on, this has been more or less the story of African leadership, that if you have to stay in power, you have to be on good terms with France. So, in what ways does France safeguard its interests in these countries? How does it make them never want to break away from it? And will this ever last? Join us today as we unravel the cruel side of France, how it dominates these 14 nations. And finally, we'll look at how these affected nations are striving hard to turn the tables. Anyone can create money, but the hard part with this is whether the rest are going to accept it. In pre-colonial times, many African societies used seashells and cowries as a medium of exchange. These were so widely circulated that by 1800 they had an official exchange rate with the French currency. But as the French Empire colonized deeper into Africa, Paris sought to monopolize these circuits of production and trade. Taxes were demanded in France, and armed troops were sent to markets, forcing merchants to accept French currency. From the 1930s onwards, France came to dominate the money supply in French-speaking Africa. With newfound power, new extrajudicial benefits emerged. Paris secured access to African labor and raw materials at below-market rates, while selling finished goods back to Africa at inflated prices. The intrusive, abrasive, and ruthless nature of French neo-colonialism was so distinct that it became known as Francafrique. Following World War II, however, things changed. Paris joined the Bretton Woods system, and as a result, the French franc was devalued to set a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar. These fiscal reforms were taking place at the time when Africa was decolonizing itself. A weaker currency only added fuel to the fire, so to hold on to its African holdings, France conjured a new currency in 1945 called the CFA francs and forced its colonies to adopt it. The CFA franc is colonialism repackaged. The franc of the French colonies in Africa during colonial times became, with independence, the franc of the Financial Community of Africa, FFCA, in West Africa, and the franc of financial cooperation in Central Africa. The French government is a specialist at reforming colonial structures using new names, and this is really the story of France's relationship with Africa. Initially, the CFA was packed to its French counterpart at a rate of 1.7 to 1. But in 1948, it was increased to 2 to 1. By overvaluing the CFA franc, Paris maintained its economic advantage while crushing Africa's export competitor business. So, in a way, France built its post-war recovery partially to a wealth transfer from Africa. In 1958, recognizing this situation, France undermined genuine decolonization by installing local collaborators and granting them statehood. These collaborators upheld France's neo-colonial empire by maintaining the franc zone and French military bases. Guinea was the only country to reject the offer, with its leader, Ahmed Sékou Touré, proclaiming that his people preferred freedom in poverty over wealth in slavery. Consequently, Guinea refused the CFA franc and sought to establish its own currency. In response, France aimed to make an example of Guinea by cutting pensions at war veterans, dismantling the country's power grid, and attempting to block its UN membership. And it didn't stop at that. France went further ahead by inducing hyperinflation by flooding the country with counterfeit bills, all the while funding armed anti-government resistance. Even though the plan didn't succeed in dislodging Sékou Touré from power, it really did bad to Guinea's economy that it never fully recovered from that. Likewise, when France sensed Togo's change of heart and its plans in ditching the CFA franc, it made another example, but this time without leaving any stones unturned. Togo's leader, Sylvanus Olympio, was assassinated in January 1963. French involvement was suspected, but official records remain conveniently closed of itself. There were further attempts to conceal imperialism. And in this situation, the CFA franc was split into two currencies covering the Central and West African states. By the mid-1970s, their respective central banks were Africanized and moved to Yaoundé and Dakar. Though local Africans staffed these institutions, there were no fundamental policy changes, and France retained veto power over the bank's governing statutes. This included a requirement that member states deposit half their exchange reserves at the French Treasury, plus another 20% for financial liabilities, meaning member states retained access only to 30% of their money. Moreover, all foreign exchange conversions were to pass through the French Treasury. You see, the way this fiscal policy works is by operations accounts. Usually, these are special accounts held at the French Treasury, and the denominations are in euros. So, when accounts are in credit, the African central banks effectively place their foreign exchange reserves at France's disposal, while if they are in debt, they will be obligated to pay interest to the French Treasury. So, you can assume that the CFA member states pay France to hold their money. Even more unsettling to this, nobody knows what France does with the money. Why? Because the French Treasury does not disclose this information even to CFA franc nations. And so, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary if France were to reinvest African funding for French profit. However, if you look at it closely, the CFA scheme is actually effective money-making scheme for France, and therefore French businesses seem to benefit as much as the French Treasury. Moreover, France doesn't need to draw on its foreign exchange reserves for African imports, and dozens of France multinationals are present in Africa, including Total Energies, Areva, and Vinci. Africa has also been a feeding ground for France, as France easily gets access to strategic resources like uranium, which is indispensable for France's nuclear energy sector, meeting 3/4 of French energy needs. Meanwhile, Mauritania delivers iron ore, Gabon is a source of crude oil, while Benin and Togo provide agricultural commodities. Additionally, the icing on the cake, French national Vince Boulevard owns most of West Africa's major ports. It is thus not by accident that former French President Jacques Chirac once stated that much of the money in French banks comes precisely from exploiting Africa, and that France would lose its global standing without its African empire. To preserve its hegemony, France has intervened militarily on the continent 40 times since the 1960s, from propping up corrupt dictators to conducting military operations in the Sahel region. To expound more on this, the system creates its own type of leadership, such that as long as the CFA franc exists, these countries will not see good leaders who are committed to the interest of their own people. Many African leaders know that talking about the CFA franc can get them into trouble, and so they try to keep quiet on this issue. Moreover, the configurations of the CFA franc allow profits and capital to be repatriated with ease. Between 1970 and 2010, Ivory Coast lost $40 billion to capital flight, which could have reduced poverty by 10% annually had it been reinvested domestically. Meanwhile, Equatorial Guinea and Congo, the primary oil producers, transferred funds equivalent to 43% and 30% of their respective GDPs between 2000 and 2009. Similar trends are observed in Gabon and Cameroon. While opulence at the top leads to widespread misery below, advocates of the CFA franc argue for its stability. However, the lack of monetary sovereignty limits the tools available to CFA member states. For example, Ivory Coast has an inflation rate below 6% compared to 29% in neighbouring Ghana. The CFA member states also lag behind other African states when it comes to growth, and even some have their growth going in a decline mode. Ivory Coast real GDP per capita is 1/3 lower than in 1978. In 2016, Senegal was at its 1960 level, as Cameroon, Congo, and Gabon have not topped their respective peaks of 1986, 1984, and 1976. This means these countries have had little to no real economic growth in decades. In recent years, though, the societies of the CFA member states have begun openly discussing alternatives, with this trend growing increasingly louder. The most viable proposal is to establish a regional currency bloc independent of French control. Some proponents suggest using the West African ECOWAS Economic Union as a launching point. This would realign the CFA franc member states around Nigeria, which contributes over 2/3 of the regional GDP. Additionally, Nigeria is a net oil exporter, while most West African states are importers, creating a natural synergy within the ECOWAS regions. However, Paris has actively sought to prevent these efforts, recognizing that nothing worth having comes easily. A lot to this effort was passed in the French Senate in January 2021. It looks to change the West African CFA franc into the ECO and then abolish the operations accounts and withdraw French personnel from the central bank. All this is to be completed by 2027, but Paris would still retain effective control, where the African monetary reserves would be held at which location remains unaddressed. Nevertheless, France is facing more and more pressure in Africa, militarily speaking, because people oppose its interventions, and, as we see in Senegal, economically speaking as well. Many French properties and businesses were destroyed. This will be a growing trend. Many people expect that what happened in Senegal will also happen in Côte d'Ivoire and also Central Africa. These uprisings were a signal to France, saying, "We know what you're doing. We know you are backing illegitimate leaders. We know you're imposing companies which drain our resources and with which we've been forced to sign unfair agreements. We no longer accept that." The French government talks about anti-French sentiment, which is framed as if Africans have this irrational hatred of the French. But French companies have been undertaking very anti-democratic work in Africa. It's natural that populations have started to oppose such practices, and it's a positive desire for liberation. Currently, Paris is in a very bad situation. Normally, the French government makes statements about situations like the one in Senegal, but this time there was no word from them. They know that if they say something, it will be badly interpreted, and this is an incredibly sensitive situation for France. Thanks for watching this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, and let's meet in our next video.